Hey class, Mr. Hanji here. For today's lesson, we're going to be taking a look at section 18.1, which is going to deal with volume of prisms and cylinders. Now, today's learning goal is that you will be able to find the volume of a prism and a cylinder. So we're going to talk about what volume is and how to find volume of different prisms and cylinders. Now, volume, okay, let's say that we have a 3D shape, in this case a cube. Volume is figuring out the amount of space that is inside that 3D shape, or the amount of space that this 3D shape takes up. So that's what volume is, and that's what we're going to figure out today. Whether we are talking about a prism, whether it's a rectangular prism, or if we're talking about a cylinder, kind of like a can, okay, we're going to talk about how you go through and find those different volumes. Now, one thing to note, when we're talking about prisms, prisms are not just rectangular or squares, yet we could have a triangular prism where it has a triangular base, but then rectangles for its sides. That makes it a prism. Or we can have a pentagonal or a hexagonal prism. So those are all different things that we can have for prisms. We're really going to spend most of our time talking about a rectangular prism and a triangular prism today. So let's start with prisms, and then we will move into cylinders. All right, to find the volume of a prism, specifically a rectangular prism, we're going to use this formula right here. Volume equals LH or LWH, which stands for volume equals length times width times height. So we have to figure out the length and the width of the base and then multiply it by the height. So when we are talking about a rectangular prism, okay, rectangular prism is going to have a base, which is that green. You go through and figure out the length and then the width, and then we multiply it by the height. So those are the three different things we need to know from a rectangular prism. Length, width, and height, and you multiply all three together. Now, a cube is where we have a shape that is made up of all squares, so all the sides are the same. So instead of having to do s times s times s, we could just do s to the power of 3. Now, I'm really going to default a lot of cubes just into rectangular prisms, okay, because it's the same idea. Length times width times height. Okay, so that's your goal when you have a rectangular prism or a cube, length times width times height. Now, for the volume of any other prism, okay, we want to use this V equals BH. In this capital B, it's not going to stand for base, like we talk about with area, where it's base times height. Yet this capital B stands for base area. So we have to find the area of the base of the prism and then multiply it by the height of that prism. So if we are talking about a triangular prism, okay, it has a triangle as its base. So that means you have to figure out the area of this triangle, and then you figure out the height of the prism. So you find the area of the triangle, this green part, and then you multiply it by the height of the prism. Base area times the height. Same thing whether you have a hexagonal prism, where you go through and find the area of the hexagon, and then you multiply it by the height of the prism. Find the area of the base, multiply it by the height. So, with that said, let's go ahead and get into example 1 today, where we go through and find the volume of some different prisms. Alright, example 1 is going to ask us, find the volume of the following prisms, round to the nearest hundredth, so that's 2 decimal places if necessary. All right, now for example 1, part A, we have a rectangular prism. So to find the volume of a rectangular prism, it's V equals LWH. Length times width times height. So if we're looking at our rectangular prism here, this is going to be our length, this is going to be our width, and then this is going to be our height. So our length is 10, our width is 7, and our height is also 7. So length times width times height. So that means we're going to do 10 times 7 times 7. So all you need to do is just use your calculator to go through and do 10 times 7 times 7. And when we go through and do that, we get 490 for the volume. So the volume of this rectangular prism is 490 yards cubed. Okay, when we talk about area, it's always units squared, but because we're talking volume, it's units cubed because we multiply by 3 different figures. Okay, just like area, you're just multiplying by 2 things. Volume, you multiply by 3, so it's cubed. So the volume, it's 490 yards cubed. And that's how you find the volume of that rectangular prism. All right, now for part B, we want to go through and do the same thing. So part B, we also have a rectangular prism. So that means we need to use the V equals LWH, length times width times height. So we need to go through and figure out what our length, width, and height are. So the length of this cube, or rectangular prism, is 5. Its width is 7. And then the height is going to be 5. So length times width times height. So now that I have my length, width, and height, all we have to do is just go through, plug those into the formula, and then multiply them all together. So we have 5 times 7 times 5. And when we go through and multiply all that together, we end up with 175. And that is the volume of this rectangular prism. 175 meters cubed. So that is how you go through and find the volume of a rectangular prism. Okay, you just have to figure out the length, width, and height, multiply all 3 together, and that gives you your volume. Alright, now for parts C and D, as you can tell, we do not have a rectangular prism, yet we have a triangular prism. So our goal for this is to go through and find the area of the triangular prisms. Now, for a triangular prism, okay, unlike just doing length times width times height, okay, we have to go through and find the area of the base, which the triangle is the base. So this triangle here and this triangle here, and then we want to multiply it by the height of the prism. Okay, the height of the prism is always going to come from the rectangles. Okay, a prism has a base that can be a rectangle, but can be any other shape, whether a triangle, pentagon, hexagon, and so on. But the sides of the prism, which is where our height is going to come from, are going to be made up of rectangles. So, with that said, if we look at C, to go through and find the volume of this triangular prism, remember that formula is V equals B times H. Now, B stands for the base area. So, the base in this case is this triangle right here. So we have to figure out the area of this triangle. Then we can go through and multiply it by the height. So area of a triangle is 1/2 length of the base of the triangle times the height of the triangle. So the base of this triangle is 12 and the height of this triangle is 4.4. So to figure out the area of this triangle, it's going to be 1/2 times 12 times 4.4. So we're going to go through and multiply all this together to figure out the area of our triangle. So if we do 1/2 times 12 times 4.4, we end up with 26.4. So that is the area of the triangle, which tells us the area of the base, which is that capital B. So this also equals capital B. So from there, to figure out the volume, so I now know what my area of the base is, 26.4. I then want to use the height of this prism. And the height of the prism, again, we're going to use the rectangle sides to help us. That, in this case, is 7. So the height of this prism is 7. So that means we're going to do 26.4 times 7. And I did times 4, but I wanted to do times 7. And we get 184.8. And that is the volume of this triangular prism. And that is how you go through and find the volume of a triangular prism. Now, anything outside of a triangle or a rectangular prism, they will likely tell you the area of the base. For example, if they want you to find the area of a pentagonal prism, they will tell you the area of the pentagon and then tell you what the height is. So all you have to do is just multiply those two numbers together. Anything that gets extreme outside of a triangle or a square, they go through and tell you that area. All right, now for D, let's just kind of go through and practice one more. So we have a triangular prism again. So that means we need to use the V equals capital B times H. So we need to figure out the area of the base. And the base in this prism is this triangle right here. Now, we need to go through and find that area, which is 1/2 base times height. The base of this triangle is going to be 8, and the height of this triangle is 6. So it's going to be 1/2 times 8 times 6. So if we go through and use our calculator, 1/2 times 8 times 6, we end up with 24. So the area of the base is 24. So I can now start plugging stuff into my volume formula. So area of my base is 24, and then the height of the prism is going to be 6. So we're just going to do 24 times 6. And that tells us that the volume of this triangular prism is 144 miles cubed. And that is our answer for part D. So, we have successfully talked about how to find the volume of a rectangular prism, as we saw with parts A and B. Then we talked about how to go through and find the volume of a triangular prism with parts C and D. Remember, rectangular prism, length times width times height. For any other prism, whether triangular and such, area of the base times by the height of the prism. Triangular prisms, they're going to have you go through and find the area of the base by using 1/2 base times height, and then you multiply it by the height of the prism. Anything beyond a triangular prism or rectangular prism, they will tell you the area of the base, whether they'll say the area of the pentagon is 25, and then the height of the prism is 7. You would just multiply those together. So, with that said, that is it for example 1 on finding volume of prisms. The next thing that we're going to take a look at is volume of a cylinder. So volume of a cylinder is going to be our next thing that we're going to take a look at for today. So cylinders, think of it as like a can would be the most common example that you are used to, or say like a Pringles can and whatnot, candles and so on. Okay, but think of it as a can. Okay, it's that shape where it has a circle on the top and on the bottom, and then it's rounded all the way around. So to find the volume of a cylinder, we're going to use this V equals pi r squared h. So what you need to know from every cylinder to figure out its volume is you need to know its radius and you need to know the height of the cylinder. Sometimes they'll tell you the diameter, but as we've talked about before, when you know the diameter, you just have to divide by 2 to know the radius. So, volume of a cylinder. This is our lifeline for today. V equals pi r squared h. Now, with that said, let's go ahead and get into finding and practicing finding the volume of some different cylinders. So, example 2 is going to have us go through and find the volume of the following cylinders, and they want us to round to the nearest hundredth if necessary. So, for a cylinder, okay, it should have a can-like shape where you have a circle on the top and on the bottom, and then it should be rounded all the way around. So we need to figure out the radius of the circle on the base, and then we're going to multiply it with this pi r squared h, and we're going to multiply it at the end by the height of the cylinder. So radius and height, and that will guide us for today. So for example 2 part A, we have this cylinder here. They tell us that the radius is 11 yards and that the height is 7 yards. So to go through and find the volume, we're going to use the pi r squared h. So it's pi, we know our radius to be 11 squared, and then we're going to multiply it by the height, which is 7. Now, you could multiply this all at once if you so choose. I'm going to go through and do step by step in case your calculator cannot handle it all at once. So first thing I'm going to evaluate is this 11 squared. So 11 to the power of 2 is 121. If we multiply by 7, that gives us 847. I'm going to pause real quick because that would be our answer in terms of pi. if it were to ever ask you for the answer in terms of pi. Evaluate your r squared, multiply it by your height, and then you just leave pi on the end, and that tells you your answer in terms of pi. If it wants pi multiplied in, and this one told us to round to the nearest hundredth, so we're going to do times pi, that 3.14, we end up with 2,660.928, and because we want to go to the nearest hundredth, that's 2 decimal places, so behind it is an 8, so we're going to round up to a 3. So 2,660.93 yards cubed, and that is the volume of that cylinder. All right, if we take a look at B, so for B, they tell me the height of this cylinder is 12 and the diameter of this cylinder is 20. So if I know the diameter is 20, that means that I know the radius is 10. They tell you the diameter, the full distance across that circle base, just divide it by 2, and that tells you the radius. So from there, the volume formula is V equals pi r squared, which is going to be 10 squared times the height, which is 12. Now, one thing I want to note, if you think about what we talked about with prisms, okay, prisms were the area of the base times by the height. What we're doing here with the volume formula of the cylinder is we're finding the area of the circle, so the area of the base, because area of the circle is pi r squared, and then we're just multiplying it by the height of the cylinder, like we multiplied by the height of the prism. So we're doing the same thing where we're finding the area of the base, and then we multiply by the height. It's just our area formula is pi r squared for the circle. All right, so if we go through and calculate this, first thing I'm going to do is the 10 squared. That gives me 100 times by 12. That gives me 1200. So we now have 1200 pi. So all we have to do is just multiply that pi in, that 3.14, and we end up with 3,769.911. Okay, we want to go to 2 decimal places, and because that third one is a 1, we're just going to keep it at 0.91. So 3,769.91 inches cubed. And that is the volume of our cylinder. All right, so with that said, that is how you go through and find the volume of a prism and how you find the volume of a cylinder. Now, that's when it's really just straight up and down, or a very clear situation when they tell you length times width times height, or they tell you the height in the base of a triangle and then the height of the prism, or the radius and the height. Now, example 3 is going to up that a little bit. So, I know these both say example 3, but this one's example 3 and then 4. So let's take a look at example 3 real quick. All right, so it says, find the volume of the following cylinders or prisms, round to the nearest hundredth if necessary. Now, for A, they tell us that the height is 3 times the radius. So the height of this cylinder is 3 times the measure of the radius. Now, they tell us the area of the base, the circle, is 81 pi. So when we are thinking area of the base, so area of a circle is pi r squared. Now, they tell us that the height is 3 times the measure of the radius. Okay, so we need to figure out what the radius is. Multiply that by 3, that tells us the height of the cylinder. And then once we know the height of the cylinder, we can multiply it with this 81 pi. So, to figure out the radius, we're going to take this area of the base, or area of the circle, 81 pi, and set it equal to pi r squared. So, to go through and figure out the value of our radius, or r, first of all, if I were to divide pi to both sides, it's going to cancel out on both sides. So the pi's cancel out, so I now have 81 equals r squared. To figure out r, we're just going to take the square root of both sides. So the square root of 81 is going to give us 9. So our radius is 9. And that's part 1. So now that I know our radius is 9, we can go through and figure out the height of this cylinder. So we can figure out the height because the height is 3 times the radius. Now the radius is 9, and if the height is 3 times that, 9 times 3 is going to give us 27. So I now know the height of our cylinder. So now that I know that height, we know the area of the base is 81. So to find the volume, it's going to be 81 pi times by 27. So if we do 81 times 27, we get 2,187 pi, and then if we multiply pi in, that 3.14, we end up with 6,870.663, and it's set to the nearest hundredth, so 2 decimal places is going to put me at 0.66, and because that's 3, it stays as 0.66. So 6,870.66 centimeters cubed. And then you would just do the same thing for part B, just a different situation. So for B, they tell us that the height is 4 times the length of one of the sides of the square base. So what you would do is take the square root of the 75, because area of a squared is s squared, and that equals 75. So that tells us that s equals, so one of the side lengths is 8.66. Now they state that the height is 4 times the length of one of the sides. So we figured out one of the sides of the square from the fact that the area of the square is 75 centimeters squared. So if the area of the square is 75, the area formula for a square is A equals s squared. So we took the 75, plugged it in for A. So to solve for s is you take the square root, that cancels out the squared. Square root of 75 is 8.66. So that is our first step. Our second step, because they tell us the height is 4 times the length of one of the sides, that means we're going to do 8.66 times by 4. And that gives us 34.64. And that's off just a touch. There we go. Alright, so now that I have the height of our prism, that means I can take this 34.64 and I can multiply it to the 75. So volume equals 75 times 34.64. And if we use our handy dandy calculator, 34.64 times by 75 gives us 2,598 centimeters cubed. So, example 3, they have you go through and take the fact that we know the area of the base, whether circle or square. They have you take that, work backwards to figure out either the radius or length of one of the sides, and then take the situation to figure out the height. Once you have the height, you can multiply that height to the area of the base for either problem. Alright, so that is example 3. Now, example 4, I know it says example 3, is it wants you to go through and find the volume of the composite figure. So what you would have to do for this is, really what they have given us is a rectangular prism, and then they have put a cylinder on top of it. So they want us to go through and find the volume of this entire shape. So that is our goal for this problem right here. Now, first thing that you would have to do is go through and find the volume of this cube, and then find the volume of this cylinder. Now, for matter of time, I'm just going to put my work up here real quick. So for the volume of the cube, for this shape right here, because it's 10 times 10 times 10, because all the sides in a cube, because they tell it's a cube, are the same. So if this is 10, that means that all of these sides around the shape are 10. So it's going to be 10 times 10 times 10, which gives us 1,000. Now, I know the radius of this cylinder is 5, and they tell me the overall height of the cylinder plus the cube is 22. Well, if I know that this is 10, you would just do 22 minus 10, which tells us the height of the cylinder is 12. So it's pi r squared h, so pi times 5 squared times 12, because we're going to do 22 minus 10, which tells us the height of this cylinder is 12. So if we go through and multiply that all in, we get 942.48. So I now have the volume of the cube, volume of the cylinder, 1,942.8, add them together, and we get 1,942.48 feet cubed. So that is how you go through and find the volume of a composite. Find the volume of the cylinder, find the volume of the cube, add them together. So with that said, that is it for our notes today on section 18.1 on finding the volume of a rectangular prism. So we talked about how to find the volume of this prism, and we also talked about how to find the volume of a triangular prism, and we ended up talking about finding the volume of a cylinder. So that is it for today on our notes for section 18.1. If you have any questions or need help with anything, as always, feel free to let me know the next time you see me or via email, and I'll be more than happy to help however I can. Otherwise, that is it for today. Thank you for listening. I hope this was helpful. Be sure to reference back as you work on your homework or look at the completed notes. And I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll talk to you guys later. All right, bye.